you already know what this is. It's one of the most famous cars on the planet. It's a DeLorean DMC-12, the car of the future, from the 80s. The DMC-12 story is an interesting one. It involves a brilliant engineer, a great idea for a new, sustainable, economical car, and a pretty massive downfall. But to get to the short of it, we need to have a look at the man whose name was above the door, John Z. DeLorean. Born in 1925, DeLorean was educated in Detroit. After getting a degree in industrial engineering, he went to Chrysler's post-grad automotive engineering course, where, as well as earning himself a degree, he did rather well. He was an engineering wunderkind. His career saw him at Packard, then on to GM, where he rocketed through the ranks. His biggest achievement, other than becoming the company's youngest division head at 40, was being credited for the Pontiac GTO. From there, he headed up Chevrolet and was certain to head up the whole company, but instead he left in 1973. His rockstar lifestyle, external business interests and other things weren't really gelling with the firm's top brass, and that led to his departure. He stated that he simply wanted a change. After a little time in the wider world, DeLorean decided he was going to revisit an old idea, one he'd had at his old job. He was going to build his own car company, and in 1974 he announced just that. Initially he was going to build a small commuter car, an eco car, but then he saw gull-wing doors and all of a sudden it became a sports car. To realise his dream, he needed money, so he took out loans from the Bank of America, got some fairly high-profile investors in the form of Johnny Carson and Sammy Davis Jr., and also set up a dealer shareholder program. He managed to set up his business without spending a single penny of his own money, which is pretty impressive. It's a skill he had until the very end. The idea behind the car he wanted to make was an ethical one, something with affordable running costs, decent performance, a corrosion-free body, and decent safety measures. The first car, a prototype called the DeLorean Safety Vehicle, appeared in the mid-70s. It was designed by Giugiaro and was pretty spectacular. However, over time, the car was completely re-engineered. The prototypes were pretty awful. Well, they were prototypes, and the car's original chief engineer, Bill Collins, found his baby handed over to Colin Chapman and Lotus. When Chapman first saw the prototype, he was less than impressed, and it was quite a job to get him to agree to develop the car. However, when he got to work, he took all the unnecessary materials out of the prototype. It ended up sitting on a double Y chassis that was remarkably similar to the Lotus Esprit of the time. The body was a glass fibre composite, and the panels were just bolted on top of that. It's said that if you put stainless steel panels on an Esprit of that vintage, well, the two cars would weigh pretty much the same. Then there's the matter of the engine. Now, many were considered, but it was a 2.8 litre V6 from a Peugeot Renault Volvo tie-up that got the gig. Despite the fact it had 2.8 litres to play with, it only had 130 horsepower. It was pretty awful, especially considering it was supposed to go in a car that weighed 1,200 kilos and was designed to take on the Porsche 911. When it came to setting up his factory, DeLorean looked to areas with high unemployment. The Republic of Ireland and Puerto Rico looked promising, but the British government stepped in and offered him a ludicrous sum of money to set up in Northern Ireland. In 1978, Dunmurry, Belfast saw the DeLorean factory steadily come to be. The idea behind the location of the factory and the government's offer was pretty smart. As you know, at the time, Northern Ireland was not a fun place to be. There was horrific fighting and blood was being shed by the gallon. Belfast was an area of high unemployment, and it was thought that if jobs were introduced to the area, it may help quell the horrific violence. With the factory set up remarkably quickly and production due to start in '79, some issues ensured production began in 1981. Then the bit we largely know about. The cars were built, shipped out to the US and then sent for sale, but there were a couple of problems. At $25,000, they cost more than a Porsche 911 and weren't all that well built. The car was developed by the folk at Lotus, who weren't used to making cars for mass production. As such, the DMC-12 was a mass-produced, hand-built car. Things were off to a shaky start. The doors were a bit of an issue. They had a tendency to get stuck, so if you had to jimmy your way out, there was a chance that once you closed the door, you couldn't get back in again, or vice versa. Then there's the alternator. In the early cars, it was pretty bad, and it would discharge power over time. And that meant a lot of customers ended up stranded. When the first batch of cars left for the US, they were sent to a quality assurance program, just so they were up to snuff for their customers. What the guys in the US saw was not pretty. They were in no fit state to go on sale. As such, they spent a lot of money basically rebuilding the cars. That said though, people really liked the DeLorean, but sadly not enough to buy one. The US car market was in pretty dire shape, and the factory just kept producing them, leaving a ton of unsold cars sat in Belfast being dirtied by a nearby factory. In early 1982, the company was in receivership and it closed its doors later that year. Around 9,000 cars had been made, far fewer than the company had promised to produce. The money ran out and no one agreed to fork out anymore. The car and the business had failed. A last-minute reprieve was apparently possible, but the paperwork requiring DeLorean's signature was on his desk while he was flying to LA to talk to some men about some white powder. In mid-air, the deadline to save his company passed. When John Z landed in LA, he was quite spectacularly nicked as part of an FBI drug sting, and although he did later clear his name, it took a while to do so. But that was pretty much the final nail in the coffin. His car had failed, his company was gone, and later down the line he applied for bankruptcy, his reputation in tatters. The great engineer, John Z. DeLorean, was done. His car, with its good looks and gull-wing doors, wouldn't entirely die though. That's thanks to a small film, you may have heard of it, Back to the Future. It cemented the DeLorean as a cult car. Many don't know the DeLorean as a DeLorean, but as the Back to the Future car. And today, I have one. I've wanted to drive one of these since I was about that big. I had no idea about the car's troubled past or anything like that. All I knew was that it looked cool, had doors that opened upwards, and it was Marty McFly's ride. So then, what's it like? This car has an interesting story to it. It's owned by the guy who runs the DeLorean Motor Company today, but it was bought way back when as a graduation present for a young girl. And she's had it pretty much forever, and she reached the point where she wasn't really driving it, wondered how much it would cost to restore it. They gave her a figure and she went, you know what, if I spend all that, I'm still never going to drive it. So he bought it, so he's fixing it up. This is a car that's been lived in. It's got about 67,000 miles on it. Bear in mind this is a car from the very early 80s. I think it's held up remarkably well. The controls are really, really heavy. They are beginning to show their age. The steering has a weird dead spot right in the middle, which is slightly concerning, and it's heavy and not spectacularly feedbacky. The transmission, again, isn't brilliant. It's quite slow, it's quite sluggish, and when it does change, it kind of jolts you. It gives you a kick in the spine. Even when you're cruising around in auto, it just, little jolt. And if you're on it, if you're trying to give it some, well, it's a bigger jolt, and that's less comfortable. Now, speaking of trying to get on it, as it were, the engine is stock. This is a completely original car, unmolested, unmodified, even though the guys at DeLorean can give you a little bit of extra go. The engine's reputation for being a bit rubbish is entirely true. It is not a fast car. It doesn't give you that acceleration that you would associate with a sports car, even one from the 80s. Well, the car feels quite heavy. So trying to put it into a corner at any speed, if the gearbox decides to put itself in a gear that gives you some, say, torque, it can feel a little bit wobbly, a little bit smushy, but then again, it was made for the US market. This particular one, yeah, it's not the greatest example in the world, but having driven it, it's a big thing to tick off my life list. It's a big thing to have done. This is easily one of the coolest cars on the face of the planet. There is so much space in here. It's really comfy. You can stretch your legs out. There's no penned-in nature to it. It doesn't feel like a more European sports car. It feels like you can stretch out, rest, sit in a nice comfy leather seat and just drive as far as you want to. The suspension, even though it's soft and soggy for handling purposes and cornering purposes, just eats up little lumps and bumps. The brakes are terrible. The brakes are really, really bad. Once you pop your foot down, you do have to wait quite a while. So we're doing 40 miles an hour on the brakes. Come on, come on, come on, and stop. Not great. And then back up to 40. Come on, car, come on, transmission. Oh, there we go. The engine doesn't sound good. It's not super efficient. But you just can't help but love it. It's so cool. The biggest disappointment though, and it's only a minor one really, because I don't really care about the handling or the drive because of the car itself. It's far greater than the sum of its parts. The big disappointment for me is that the speedo only goes up to 85, which means I can't legitimately see 88 on it. And that makes me sad. I'm in a DeLorean and the doors open upwards and it's made of stainless steel. And it's one of the coolest cars on the face of the planet, and it will forever be one. We have this car because although the DeLorean Motor Company is dead, the DeLorean Motor Company is still alive in Humble, Texas. They'll restore your DMC-12, sell you a used one, or sell you some rather lovely DMC-12 inspired stuff. Well, DeLorean's initial idea was pretty clever. The car's checkered development led to an interesting finished product. File that one under O for oddity, I suppose. One thing is certain though, this car is going to be remembered fondly for years. Its creator less so. But his story is another one for another day.